Hello, welcome to today's discussion on bias and variance. So, bias and variance are basically tools which can be used for thinking about how to reduce the error of our model or a learning error, right? Because sometimes when we're training a model, we reach a certain stage that after which we are not able to reduce our error, or we are not able to process our data better so that we could get our results or the outputs in a better way. So we proceed to bias and variance decomposition, right? So before discussing what bias and variance are, let's discuss what do they mean and what their definitions are. So our bias is basically defined as our expected error due to the mismatch between the learner's hypothesis space and the space of target concepts, right? So the learner hypothesis space is basically our y labels, right? The target values that we want to achieve, and the space of target concepts is basically learner's hypothesis space is y hat, because this is the output of our model, right? And space of target concepts is basically y, that is the target values that we want to achieve. So bias is basically the difference between the predicted value and the output value, right? That is, the bias is basically error due to that, the mismatch between the expected value and the target value, right? So if I want to express it in terms of easier ways, I would say bias is how far are we from our truth value, right? So this is how you define our bias, right? Now let's proceed on to variance. So our variance is defined as our expected error due to the difference in the training set used, right? So if I want to express it into a simpler definition, I would say that variance is basically how noisy is our model, right? By noisiness, I mean, let's say we're talking about a particular data set, right? So if in a particular data set, if samples are of same class, they are more likely to be grouped together, right? But if our model is noisy or if our variance is high, the output would not be grouped so closely together, right? So that means there is noise in here. That is why the output that we are getting, it's not clustered together in, right? So if I want to express it in terms of diagram, it will be something like this. Right, let's say we have two axes, right? So if we go from here to here, this is increasing bias, right? And from here to here, it's increasing variance, right? So now let's say we have a target value, right? So I'll tell you what these 4 points are, right? So this at this point, I would try to explain a diagram which is having high bias and low variance, right? This is low variance and this is high variance. This is low bias and this is high bias, right? So this point would have high bias and low variance. Similarly, at this point, I'll describe a model. I'll be describing a model having low bias and low variance. Similarly, high bias and high variance model, and a low bias, high variance model, right? So if I'm saying there is low bias would mean that all the values or the y hats that we are getting out of the model, the target value is very close to them, right? So if we are building a model which has low bias, the values will be very close to the target value, right? So it will be around somewhere around this area, right? And if you're talking about low variance, right? Low variance would mean that our model is not so noisy. That means the values of same class will be grouped really close together, right? So if I'm trying to see a model having low bias, low variance, it would be something of this kind, grouped very closely together, right? Now, if I'm saying I have a model having low variance and high bias, right? Low variance would mean they're grouped together, but high bias would mean that they are very far apart from the actual truth value, right? These are a truth value, right? The values that we want, the target values, the target truth values, right? The Y's. So if I have a model with low variance but high bias, it would be something of this sort, that the target value are very far apart from the values that our model is predicting, but they are grouped together because it's low variance, right? So now let's say we have a model which is having high bias and high variance. High bias and high variance would be a model having none of the values close to target value and all spread very far apart, right? Because variance is high and bias is high, so none of them are close to the target values, right? Now let's say we have a model having low bias and high variance, right? So low bias, high variance would be something of this sort. Okay, so let's draw it more cleanly. I would say something of this sort. Okay, so a model having low bias and high variance, this is the case of overfitting, right? So from this, we basically get to a formula where basically we define our expected error as bias square plus variance, right? We'll discuss more upon and stress more upon this formula later on. So let's say we have a data set D and we take two samples out of it, S1 and S2, right? We have two learning models, L1 and L2, right? So if the output of the model is same or very similar for both of these samples, S1 and S2 from the same data set, we say that such an algorithm is a stable algo, right? So if I write it like L1, if I is almost similar to L1 of S2, then it's a stable algorithm, right? But if in the case of L2, let's say the expected output, the output of the model for S1 is not similar to S2, we say such an algorithm is an unstable algorithm, right? So if I want to give an example for stable algorithm, I would say KNN, right? And an unstable algorithm would be decision tree, right? So a stable algo has high bias, whereas an unstable algo has an high variance, right?